What if I told you that many of your current conflicts didn't start now, they started when you were still too young to understand what was happening? The psychology of the inner child invites us to face an uncomfortable truth: growing up does not automatically make us whole. Often, it only makes us more skilled at hiding pain, while the unconscious continues to operate silently behind decisions, fears, and even relationships. Carl Jung was one of the first to state that what is not welcomed within us does not disappear, it just changes form. The wounded inner child resurfaces as anxiety, self-sabotage, repeated emotional patterns, and a relentless search for conditional love. You may even achieve external success, but still feel an emptiness that you can't explain. And no, this is not weakness, it is a call to individuation. In this content, you will understand how emotional healing does not involve fixing who you are, but integrating parts that have been rejected throughout your life. Let's talk about shadow, authenticity, self-compassion, and emotional security in a clear, human, and applicable way. If you have ever felt like something in you was left behind, perhaps this is the invitation your unconscious has been waiting for. Growing up, many people grow emotionally. Maturing is another conversation. From an early age, the inner child learns that feeling too much is a problem, so pain becomes something to be hidden, not understood. This habit descends into the unconscious, shaping emotional patterns that seem normal, but that carry very silent childhood wounds. This is how we learn to function, but not necessarily to live authentically. In practice, this appears when the adult smiles at work, delivers results, but comes home exhausted inside. Emotional healing does not begin when everything goes well, but when you realize that you are just surviving emotionally. Carl Jung already warned that ignoring these internal parts pushes pain into the shadows, where it acts in the form of self-sabotage. And the more you pretend you don't feel it, the more your body and mind find a way to warn you. You may have heard phrases like "swallow your tears" or "that's all in your head." Because that's when the inner child learns that love is conditional and that feeling is not safe. Real maturation begins when you exchange toughness for self-compassion and create a modicum of internal emotional security. This movement does not solve everything at once, but it opens an important door to the next step of individuation. Even after becoming an adult, the childish self remains there, quietly, observing everything from the unconscious. The inner child does not disappear with time, it just changes language. Instead of crying, she reacts with anxiety, avoids conflict, or seeks approval at any cost. Carl Jung explained that what is not consciously accepted begins to direct our choices invisibly. This is why certain situations seem disproportionate. A simple criticism turns into an emotional earthquake. It's not the adult reacting, it's the child self touching old childhood wounds. These emotional patterns do not appear out of nowhere, they are emotional memories asking for integration. Making this aware is, in itself, a profound step in emotional healing. A simple exercise helps a lot when something destabilizes you. Ask, how old is this pain? This pause creates space between you and the automatic reaction, opening a dialogue with your inner child. Little by little, the unconscious stops commanding on autopilot and starts collaborating with you. And it is precisely this listening that sets the stage for understanding how these brands shape relationships and self-esteem. Childhood wounds are not stored in an old album, they remain alive, influencing reactions in the present. A small rejection can sound like abandonment, and silence can become a threat. The inner child interprets the world based on what it learned back then, and the unconscious just repeats the known script. This is how emotional patterns settle, and without asking for permission. In relationships, this is even more evident. Those who grew up with conditional love tend to confuse affection with excessive effort, fear of loss, or the constant need to please. Self-esteem ends up tied to external validation, creating cycles of self-sabotage that are difficult to perceive. Carl Jung would say that it is not bad luck in love, it is unintegrated content asking for attention. A good start is to observe your most intense reactions: jealousy, defensiveness, exaggerated guilt. Instead of judging yourself, Practice self-compassion and curiosity. Ask yourself where this emotion was born and what it tries to protect. This Kinderlook strengthens emotional security and paves the way to understanding why certain patterns insist on repeating themselves in adult life. When love was conditioned in childhood, the inner child learns a silent rule: I am only loved if I live up to expectations. This learning becomes a strategy for emotional survival, not true affection. In the unconscious, love becomes synonymous with effort, excessive adaptation, and constant fear of making mistakes. Point 1 grows functional, but internally on alert. In adult life, this appears in emotional patterns that repeat themselves, like replays, unbalanced relationships, difficulty saying no, and guilt when prioritizing oneself. Self-sabotage comes into play when healthy love seems too strange. Carl Jung pointed out that the familiar, even painful, often seems safer than the emotionally stable unknown. A practical step is to review your emotional exchanges. Where do you abandon yourself to maintain bonds? Creating emotional security starts with small limits, even if they are uncomfortable at first. Exchanging conditional love for conscious presence requires training, not perfection, and this awareness makes room for a greater movement, what Jung called individuation. For Carl Jung, individuation is not becoming someone better, but rather becoming whole. It is the process of recognizing that the inner child, shadow, and functioning adult coexist within you. When internal parts are ignored, the unconscious takes the toll in the form of internal conflict and repetition of emotional patterns. To individualize yourself is to stop running away from yourself. This path is neither linear nor comfortable, and that's okay. Reading Jung helps, but applying it to everyday life is where things get real. Books like Man and His Symbols are great starting points. Individuation begins when you observe your reactions without fully identifying with them. This weakens self-sabotage and strengthens authenticity. A simple exercise is to write down, at the end of the day, when you acted automatically and when you were present. This habit makes the unconscious a little more conscious, day after day. Emotional healing here does not come from controlling everything, but from integrating what was previously rejected. And this integration sets the stage for breaking deeper emotional cycles. While the unconscious rules alone, life tends to repeat the same scripts. Changing cities, jobs, or relationships doesn't solve the problem when the inner child continues to react in the same way. Carl Jung said that what does not become conscious returns as destiny. Making these contents visible is a profound act of emotional healing. In practice, this starts with daily observation. Whenever an emotion arises too strongly, it carries old information. Instead of running away, try naming what you feel and recording it in a notebook. It sounds simple, but it breaks powerful emotional patterns. This contact reduces self-sabotage and increases the feeling of choice. Over time, you realize that it is not the emotion that controls you, but the silence about it. Creating this internal dialogue strengthens emotional security and authenticity. The unconscious stops being an enemy and becomes an ally. And it is at this point that many discover a curious paradox: external success does not always accompany internal fulfillment. It is possible to achieve a lot and still feel a void that is difficult to explain. When the inner child is not welcomed, success becomes an attempt at emotional compensation. The unconscious seeks external recognition to fill childhood wounds that were never heard. On the outside, applause inside. An uncomfortable silence. This emptiness often generates curious emotional patterns: working too much, pursuing goals without taking a break, or feeling guilty when resting. Self-sabotage appears when rest seems too dangerous. Carl Jung remembered that without internal integration, any achievement loses flavor. The problem is not ambition, it is confusing personal value with performance. A powerful antidote is to rescue small sources of pleasure without a productive purpose. Reading for pleasure, walking without a goal, or returning to something you loved as a child strengthens emotional security. These simple gestures give space back to the inner child and point to a path where pain does not need to be wasted. And this is where the archetype of the wounded healer emerges. The archetype of the wounded healer shows that many people sensitive to the pain of others actually carry unresolved childhood wounds. The inner child learns early to observe, welcome, and care as a form of emotional survival. In the unconscious, Helping becomes a way of keeping love close by. Carl Jung saw this movement not as a flaw, but as a latent potential for individuation. The problem arises when caring for others replaces caring for yourself. Self-sabotage appears disguised as altruism, while pain itself remains in the shadows. True emotional healing begins when the healer turns his gaze inward and recognizes his own limits. Transforming pain into wisdom requires integration, not constant sacrifice. A simple exercise is to ask, does this what I do come from choice or from the need to be accepted? This reflection strengthens authenticity and creates more emotional security. When the inner child stops carrying the weight of pain alone, something changes profoundly. And this shift sets the stage for understanding that healing is not perfection, but ongoing presence. Many people embark on the path of emotional healing thinking they will fix something broken, but the inner child doesn't need correction, it needs presence. Being with you on good days and, especially, on confusing days creates real emotional security. In the unconscious, this constancy communicates something new. It is now safe to feel. Self-compassion isn't about rubbing your head, it's about stopping attacking yourself. When you listen to your emotions without judgment, the shadow loses strength and emotional patterns begin to loosen. Carl Jung reinforced that what we welcome changes. Healing doesn't happen when everything gets better, but when you don't abandon yourself in the process. A simple habit helps a lot. When you make a mistake, replace self-criticism with a gentle question: what is this trying to teach me? This change reduces self-sabotage and strengthens authenticity. Healing is an ongoing relationship with yourself, not a finish line, and it is this posture that opens up space to integrate previously rejected parts of the psyche. The inner child not only carries fragility, she also holds emotions that were repressed too soon. Anger, fear, sadness, and even intense joy end up pushed into the shadows, that psychic space that the unconscious uses to hide what was not accepted. Carl Jung taught that denying these parts does not eliminate them, it only makes them more influential. Integration is looking without running away. In adult life, the shadow appears in exaggerations, judgments, and emotional triggers. What bothers the other person most often points to something unrecognized in themselves. Instead of fighting with these reactions, emotional healing invites curiosity. When you recognize these rejected parts, the emotional patterns lose intensity. A practical exercise is to observe what you avoid feeling or showing. Ask yourself where you learned that this was not acceptable. This listening strengthens internal integration and creates more authenticity. And the more these parts are welcomed, the clearer the next step becomes, becoming the adult that the inner child always needed. At some point in the process, it becomes clear that no one will come to rescue that injured child from the past. And, interestingly, that's not sad, it's liberating. Becoming the adult that the inner child needed means assuming the role of presence, protection, and emotional validation today. The unconscious begins to register that there is someone in charge now. This translates into simple but profound attitudes: respecting your limits, honoring your feelings, and stopping abandoning yourself to maintain external peace. Emotional healing happens when you choose emotional security over approval. Carl Jung saw this movement as a milestone in individuation, where the subject stops living reactively. Here, self-compassion stops being a concept and becomes a daily practice. A powerful exercise is to imagine what you would have needed to hear in difficult times as a child and say that to yourself today. It may seem strange at first, but this internal dialogue reorganizes old emotional patterns. The inner child relaxes when he notices coherence between words and attitudes, and this alignment paves the way for broader and more stable integration. Integration is not about erasing the past, it is about giving it a worthy place within you. When the inner child, the shadow, and the conscious adult walk together, life gains more coherence. The unconscious stops pulling hidden strings, because it has already been heard. Carl Jung saw integration as the point where emotional healing stops being an effort and becomes an internal state. Living authentically becomes a consequence, not a goal. You act more clearly, choose with less fear, and respond instead of react. Emotional patterns still emerge, but they no longer rule. There is more emotional security because you trust in your own ability to accept what you feel. At this point, life gains meaning not through the absence of pain, but through the presence of consciousness. Self-sabotage loses space for aligned choices, and conditional love no longer dictates internal rules. Integration transforms childhood wounds into a source of living emotional maturity, and it is from this ground that the journey continues, always in motion. Along this path, one thing becomes clear: the inner child was never the problem was having learned too early to shut up, adapt and survive. Emotional healing begins when you decide to stop running away from yourself and choose to integrate what has been pushed into the unconscious. Not to relive the pain, but to give it a new meaning within your story. Now it's worth reflecting: what emotional patterns have you been repeating without realizing it? When does self-sabotage still speak louder than self-compassion? What parts of your shadow continue to ask for listening and integration? Carl Jung reminds us that individuation is not about becoming someone ideal, but rather becoming who you really are, with more authenticity, emotional security, and presence. If this content touched something in you, don't let that perception go unnoticed. Start small, observe your reactions, embrace your inner child, and practice more conscious choices in everyday life. And if you want to continue deepening this process, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to follow more content about deep psychology, emotional healing, and inner development.